The story begins in London during the early 1920s, where a dedicated and somewhat reserved bacteriologist named Walter Fane finds himself completely captivated by the presence of a young woman named Kitty Garstin during his brief visit to the city. She moves through the social circles of London with an ease that feels foreign to him, someone who has spent most of his life buried in scientific research and medical studies. The attraction is immediate and overwhelming for Walter, who sees in her something that seems to represent everything his austere life lacks. He proposes marriage with a sincerity that borders on desperation, and she accepts his offer, though her motivations are far less romantic than his. What drives her decision is not love, or even genuine affection, but rather the urgent need to escape the suffocating control of her mother, a woman whose constant criticism and pressure have made her home feel like a prison. The engagement happens quickly, almost impulsively, and soon they find themselves honeymooning in Venice, surrounded by the romantic canals and historic architecture, though the emotional distance between them is already beginning to show. After their brief interlude in Italy, the newlyweds travel to Shanghai, where Walter has been stationed as part of his work with the British government, specifically researching infectious diseases in a laboratory setting. The city is vibrant and complex, filled with the bustling energy of expatriate life and the underlying tensions of colonial society. Kitty quickly discovers that she has little interest in the scientific work that consumes her husband's attention, and she gravitates instead toward the social gatherings and parties that define the British community in Shanghai. Her days are filled with tennis matches, afternoon teas, and elaborate dinners, where she can indulge in the superficial pleasures that have always appealed to her. It becomes increasingly clear that the marriage was built on a foundation of mutual misunderstanding, with Walter seeking companionship from someone who values excitement over intellectual connection. The emotional gap between them widens with each passing week as they struggle to find common ground in their radically different approaches to life. During one of these social events, Kitty encounters Charles Townsend, a charismatic British vice consul who possesses all the charm and social grace that her husband seems to lack. Charles is married to a woman named Dorothy, but that fact does little to deter the growing attraction between him and Kitty. He has mastered what he calls the science of popularity, understanding exactly how to make people feel special and desired in his presence. The affair begins gradually at first, with stolen glances and carefully orchestrated conversations, but it quickly escalates into something more consuming and reckless. Kitty finds herself drawn to the excitement and passion that Charles offers, qualities that have been completely absent from her marriage to Walter. The relationship continues in secret for some time, with Kitty believing that her husband is too absorbed in his laboratory work to notice her frequent absences and changed behavior. However, Walter is far more observant than she realizes, and he eventually discovers the truth about her relationship with Charles. The confrontation between Walter and Kitty is devastating in its coldness and controlled anger. Rather than expressing his hurt through emotional outbursts, Walter approaches the situation with calculated precision, presenting her with an ultimatum that is designed to punish her as thoroughly as possible. He offers her two choices. She can agree to a public proceeding that will expose her infidelity to their entire social circle, resulting in complete social disgrace and isolation, or she can accompany him to a remote village called Mei Tanfu in inland China, where he has volunteered to help combat a severe outbreak. However, there is a third option that Walter mentions almost as an afterthought. He will agree to a quiet separation if Charles is willing to leave his wife Dorothy and marry Kitty instead. Kitty approaches Charles with this proposition, believing that his declarations of love were genuine and that he would be willing to abandon his current life for her. Instead, she discovers the painful truth that his affection was never as deep as he claimed, and he flatly refuses to leave his wife or accept any responsibility for their relationship. Devastated by this rejection and trapped by Walter's ultimatum, Kitty has no choice but to agree to accompany her husband to the remote village. The journey to Mei Tanfu takes approximately 2 weeks and is deliberately made as difficult and uncomfortable as possible. Walter chooses an overland route through mountainous terrain rather than the much faster and easier river passage, clearly intending to make his wife suffer for her betrayal. The trip is arduous and exhausting, with long days of travel through rough landscapes that seem to stretch endlessly before them. When they finally arrive at their destination, Kitty discovers that the living conditions are far worse than she could have imagined. Their accommodation is sparse and primitive, located at a considerable distance from the village itself, offering none of the comforts or conveniences she has always taken for granted. The region is in the grip of a serious health crisis, with many people suffering and the situation growing worse each day. Adding to the tension and danger, the area is also experiencing unrest related to the ongoing tensions within China itself, with the threat of conflict always present in the background. Their neighbor, a British deputy commissioner named Waddington, lives in stark contrast to their own circumstances, enjoying relative luxury and comfort in his home, which he shares with a young Chinese woman named Wan Shi. Waddington maintains a cheerful demeanor despite the surrounding circumstances, and his presence provides a small window into the complex dynamics between the Western officials and the local population. Meanwhile, Kitty finds herself isolated for long stretches of time, with only a cook and a Chinese soldier assigned to protect her during the periods of civil unrest. Walter barely speaks to her, maintaining a wall of silence that feels even more punishing than angry words would have been. The emotional distance between them seems insurmountable, and Kitty begins to wonder if their marriage can ever recover from the damage that has been done. Seeking some form of purpose to fill the empty hours, Kitty begins visiting an orphanage that is run by a group of French nuns who have dedicated themselves to caring for children who have been orphaned or abandoned. She volunteers to help, and they assign her to work in the music room where she can assist with activities and provide some small comfort to the children. During one of her conversations with the Mother Superior who leads the convent, Kitty receives surprising information about her husband that challenges her previous understanding of his character. The nun mentions that Walter shows remarkable tenderness and affection when he visits the orphanage, particularly with the babies and youngest children. This revelation stuns Kitty, who has only seen her husband as cold and emotionally distant, never imagining that he possesses such capacity for warmth and care. She begins to observe him more carefully, watching how he interacts with the villagers and how tirelessly he works to help combat the outbreak that has devastated the community. Walter throws himself completely into his work, determined to find solutions to the crisis that is claiming so many lives in the village. He recognizes that the primary source of the problem lies in the contaminated water supply, and he begins designing a system of channels and pathways to bring clean water from safer sources to the affected areas. The project is ambitious and requires careful planning and coordination with the local population, but Walter approaches it with the same methodical precision that he brings to all his scientific endeavors. Kitty watches as he works alongside the villagers, showing them respect and treating them as equals rather than approaching them with the typical colonial arrogance that characterizes so many Western officials in China. She sees him become nauseous and overwhelmed when first confronted with the full reality of the suffering around them. Yet he continues working despite his own discomfort. This courage and dedication begin to shift something in how Kitty perceives her husband, replacing her earlier contempt with a growing sense of respect and admiration. As the weeks pass, the frozen silence between them begins to thaw in small, almost imperceptible ways. They start having brief conversations about practical matters related to the village and the work being done there, and gradually these exchanges become longer and more personal. Kitty discovers that Walter is not the emotionless man she had believed him to be, but rather someone who feels things deeply and has simply never learned how to express those feelings adequately. He begins to see her differently as well, noticing how she has committed herself to working with the children at the orphanage, and how she has adapted to the difficult living conditions without complaint. The harsh circumstances of their situation, paradoxically, create an environment where they can finally begin to know each other as real people, rather than the fantasies they had projected onto each other. The respect that develops between them gradually deepens into something that resembles genuine affection, and eventually into the kind of love that their marriage should have been built upon from the beginning. During this period of growing closeness, Kitty makes a discovery that complicates everything. She realizes she is expecting a child. The news fills her with anxiety because she cannot be certain whether Walter or Charles is the father, given the timing of her affair and the early days of her time in China. She agonizes over whether to tell Walter, fearing that this revelation will destroy the fragile connection they have been building. When she finally shares the news with him, she also confesses her uncertainty about the child's paternity, bracing herself for his anger or rejection. Instead, Walter responds with a tenderness that surprises her completely, telling her that the question of biological fatherhood does not matter to him. He has fallen in love with her again, or perhaps truly for the first time, and he is prepared to raise the child as his own, regardless of its origins. This moment represents a profound transformation for both of them, as they finally achieve the emotional intimacy and mutual understanding that had eluded them throughout their relationship. Walter's system for bringing clean water to the village begins to show results, and the number of new cases starts to decline as the population gains access to uncontaminated sources. The success of his efforts brings hope to a community that had been devastated by loss and suffering, and Walter becomes a respected figure among the villagers. However, just as the situation seems to be improving, a new wave of people arrives from other regions where the outbreak continues unchecked. These refugees bring the contamination with them, threatening to undo all the progress that has been made. Walter immediately sets about establishing a separate encampment outside the main village, where these newcomers can be quarantined and treated, hoping to prevent the spread to the areas that have finally begun to recover. He works even more intensively than before, spending long hours at the camp and exposing himself repeatedly to the dangerous conditions. The inevitable happens when Walter himself falls ill, contracting the same disease he has been fighting so hard to control. Kitty is overcome with fear and determination as she takes on the role of his primary caregiver, refusing to leave his side despite the risk to herself and her unborn child. She tends to him with a devotion that springs from genuine love rather than duty, wiping his fevered brow, helping him take water, and speaking softly to him during his moments of consciousness. Despite her desperate efforts and the depth of her care, Walter's condition continues to deteriorate. His body, weakened by months of overwork and stress, cannot fight off the infection. Kitty watches helplessly as the man she has finally learned to love slips away from her, and Walter passes away, leaving her devastated and alone in the remote Chinese village. The loss is crushing, made even more painful by the knowledge that they had such little time together once they finally understood each other. She is left pregnant and grieving, far from everything familiar, having to face the reality that she will raise her child without the father who had promised to love it unconditionally. Following Walter's passing, Kitty makes the difficult journey back to England, returning to the country she left as a newlywed, filled with entirely different emotions than she feels now. 5 years pass, during which she rebuilds her life and raises her son, whom she has named Walter in honor of her late husband. The child grows into a bright and engaging young boy who brings joy back into her life after the darkness of her loss. On a pleasant day in London, Kitty and her son are out together, well-dressed and apparently content, shopping for flowers to bring to Walter's grandfather during their planned visit. The scene shows a woman who has found peace and purpose, transformed by her experiences in China and by the love she discovered too late. As they walk through the London streets, they encounter Charles Townsend quite by chance, the man whose rejection had set in motion the entire chain of events that so dramatically altered Kitty's life. He approaches them with his characteristic charm, suggesting that they should arrange to meet and reconnect. His eyes fall on the young boy, and he asks the child his age with an intensity that reveals his calculation. When the boy answers, Charles realizes from the mathematics of timing that there is a possibility he might be looking at his biological son. The revelation clearly affects him, and he seems to expect some acknowledgement or opportunity from Kitty. However, the woman standing before him is no longer the naive and shallow person who sought excitement in his arms years ago. Kitty has been fundamentally changed by her experiences in China, by the love she found and lost, and by the responsibilities of motherhood. When young Walter asks his mother who the man is, she looks at Charles with complete clarity and responds that he is no one important, just a stranger they happen to encounter. She takes her son's hand and walks away from Charles without looking back, leaving him standing alone on the street. The gesture represents her final rejection of the superficial values and selfish choices that once defined her, and her embrace of the deeper understanding of love and commitment that Walter taught her through his example and sacrifice.